Hellenic Greece, around 800 to 300 BCE. When we talk about Hellenic Greece, we're talking about what is often called classical Greece. It's this period that happens between, if you had to read the Iliad or the Odyssey, so it's the period between what was the Mycenaean period, way back when, and then later on you have Alexander the Great, and what follows after him, Hellenism. That middle period, that classical Greek period, is Hellenic Greece. And when we use Hellenism later, just notice that Hellenic ends at the C. Hellenism is going to keep going. What are the major things you need to know about it? Of course, one of the critical things is to understand that Hellenic Greece is a sea culture. If you remember the Phoenicians are the great rivals of Greece. They're the great stimulators for Greece and its sort of rebound. And if you look at this map we've got up here, you'll notice that the trade routes are what's marked in green, and then you have all the little cities around it, some of which are major Phoenician colonies, those are the ones in red, some of which are Greek colonies, those are the ones in black. You'll notice how they circle the Mediterranean. For them, you don't go over land, you go by boat. And what matters is the distance you travel by sea, not the distance you would travel by land. It's a heavily sea-oriented culture. The Phoenicians are their great rivals, but they also depend on them in the sense that the Phoenicians are where they adopt the Greek alphabet from, or what becomes the Greek alphabet, and that same alphabet, even though when you look at your fraternities or sorority names, Chi Rho or whatever they are, it probably doesn't look like that, but that's the ancestor of the alphabet we use today. All the way starting from the Phoenicians, then the Greeks, and then future developments after that. The center of life in Hellenic Greece is the Polis, the city-state. And if you look at this aerial photograph of Athens, it's a modern aerial photograph, so obviously this is what it looks like today. But that area right at the center, that little kernel there, that's what is left of that ancient polis, that ancient center. And that's what the polis was. The polis, the city-state, are held together with each other because they share a Hellenic culture. That involves their language, that involves their religious beliefs. They have the same pantheon of gods. They have a lot of the same cultural practices. They speak the same language. They use the same writing system. So they have all those things in common. They also share the mythology and of the works that comes from the Homer. So the Odyssey, the Iliad, those tales, that mythology is an important part of them as well. So they're held together on the cultural level, but in practical terms, they're all independent, competitive, warring city-states. They go to war with each other on a regular basis. It's part of what makes them them. So it's going to be like some of these other city-states we talk about. Probably one of the best examples is when we talk about the Maya later on in Central America. Very similar setup in the sense that shared culture, independent cities, fiercely competitive. The two leading city-states, the most influential, are Sparta and Athens. And the plural is pole for polis. And they're the major competitors. They're the major sort of leaders. They're often seen as the two are sort of offering two versions of what it means to be classical Greek. Each polis, part of what holds itself together is they tend to believe or say that they have a shared patron god or goddess, one that looks after the city. In the case of Athens, it's obvious it's Athena, the goddess Athena, and what you're looking at there is a statue, a replica of the statue. The original, if you could read the writing there, was over 40 feet high, covered in gold. There's sort of one of the crises of the 5th century was that people were stealing the gold and melting it down to deal with various financial problems of the city of Athens. She eventually just sort of basically collapses after all the depredations. But the belief is there's this patron god or goddess who looks after your city. Often there's also a mythology that says that all of us in our city, all of us natives to this city, we have a shared common ancestor, some kind of story about that. And so, there's this belief that we are held together by this descent. And to some extent, in a sort of remote way, we're all family in this city. After each polis reaches a certain point, once it starts to become what they believe is too big, they encourage people to leave to set up colonies. So often, you'll have mother cities and daughter cities, and the daughter cities, at least in theory, are supposed to have some loyalty back to the mother city, and the mother city is supposed to act as some kind of an advocate for her daughter cities, her colonies. At the center of the city, there's the Acropolis, the city center. And the one we know the most about is the one at Athens. And you can see the remains of it in an area photograph, like the previous one you saw in Athens. At the city center, the thing is these polises were often built around a small mountain or hill, however you want to describe it, I guess, in perspective. And so that area at the top of that, it's a high place, which is often seen as religiously significant. It brings you closer to the sky. So that's where the state sanctuary is. A lot of the temples are. That's where the religious festivals take place. But also, because it's high and fortified, in case of war, if people are invading the city, this is where everybody's supposed to retreat to. This is sort of your last place to defend, because you're looking down on the people who are invading from this place. You've got it fortified. Hopefully you've stocked it up with a lot of resources, food, water, and this is where you take refuge in the case of war. And then the enemy has to do their best to break their way into the Acropolis. The Agora is the marketplace, and there's a drawing of what somebody thinks it might have looked like. It's a place where people go to buy and sell goods of various types. It's where the law courts take place. It's a common meeting place. If you are a philosopher, this is where you would hang out to try to find students, sort of basically instead of a situation here where you guys come to study at the university and you sign up for classes with the professors. Instead, the professors would all be sort of standing there on the sidewalk and advertising their various wares, and you would maybe take a lecture here, take a lecture there, learning from people as you went, sort of paying as you go. It's primarily a male space. And what that means is it's dominated by men, male citizens, people of some status, men of some status. And that's where they're supposed to be and talk. Doesn't mean that there aren't any women there, but the women who are there because they're poor and they have to run, their own business. They're buying and selling goods there. They're servant or slave girls who have been sent to fetch various things, or possibly they're little girls who are there to run errands. Okay? And possibly prostitutes of various types. But for respectable women, the Agora isn't where they're supposed to be. The center of Greek life is the household and the sort of the family group in that household. What you're seeing here on the right is it's actually a stele, a carving that would be next to a grave to represent the family. And so you've got the father, you've got the mother, and you've got the little kid, all there represented in this grave marker as a family group. The household was the center of life. It's where people lived, but like it is for most societies historically, it's also the center of production. So when we talk about work often as something that people do outside of the home, right? And you'll often hear people say things like, well, she's just a housewife. She just stays at home. She doesn't have a job. That wouldn't occur to anybody in an ancient society because, of course, where you do your work is where you live. So raw materials like grain may come into the house and be turned into flour, be turned into bread, be turned into minor things. Grain may come in and be brewed and turned into beer. It may come in a multitude of facets. Fruit will come in to be preserved or being prepared in various ways. Wool will come in to be woven into cloth. Taken as wool, spun into yarn, woven into cloth. And so a whole range of goods are produced. The goods of daily life are usually produced within the household. Some for use at the household itself and some for sale. So like cloth is something in particular that women spend their time producing because it's one of the great goods that Athens sells. No, not just Athens, all these Greek city-states. It's one of their goods that they sell. The household includes the husband, it includes the wife, it includes the children, it includes any kind of dependent relatives they have. So, maybe somebody's cousin or daughter or whoever who has been left without a household in the world of their own. It also includes their servants and slaves. For the most part, everybody has to live within a household. It's just how people do it. And you will belong to a household regardless. So your servants and your slaves, they don't go home somewhere else. They live in the household with you. The household, according to many, at least according to most accounts, was at least to some extent divided by gender. That you have the first floor, which is the public spaces, the male spaces, the places for entertaining outsiders. You heard of symposiums. That's a thing we use now for classes. In classical Greece, those were actually dinner parties, and those dinner parties would take place in those public spaces. The second floor was more for women. That's where sleeping took place. It's where women stayed if there were outsiders in the house. It was also undoubtedly where their looms were set up for weaving, which, like I said, was one of the major occupations. If you look at that vase, that's what they're trying to show you. On the far left, looking at it, I don't know if you can see it, but that's a woman taking yarn and she's spinning it into thread. In the middle, they're weaving it into cloth on a loom. Those two women are working together, and then you can't see the far right where they're actually turning it into a piece of clothing. But making cloth, that's the center of women's work in many cases. That and food preparation and production. Okay. The most important group in the Greek polis were the male citizens. They were the ones who were sort of seen as the emblem of the city, the core of the city. What it means to be a man in these Greek polises, to be a full man with full rights, full citizenship. You are a citizen, you are a farmer, you are a soldier. And you can sort of see a little bit of this perhaps represented here. What you're actually looking at is male athletes showing their power, their physical power in that case, and engaging in the other Greek roles. The critical thing to demonstrate your manhood is to be dominant in your relationships. And so if you were talking about a sexual relationship as an adult male with either males or women, the important thing is how you relate to those individuals. So if you are the dominant person in a relationship with a younger male, that's acceptable. For the younger male to be submissive in that relationship would be acceptable as well because he hasn't reached that level of full status, usually. Same thing, women are expected to be submissive in the relationship. So from the viewpoint of the Greek city-state, they're not going to be all that concerned about if you are a male citizen who sleeps with male or female prostitutes. That's not really a big issue. What would matter is if you were found to be subordinate in your relationship. And this is tied in a number of levels, including the fact that one of the major divisions in Greek life was between free men and slaves. And one of the major ways that men became slaves, and women, was through losing a war. So in a very literal sense, to be a slave, to be a man without status and standing, to not be a true man, was to be a slave, to be a loser, to be someone who has been forced to submit. One of the big defining experiences for Greek manhood in this era was serving in the hoplites. And you can see sort of the picture of them there fighting two Greek sets of Greek hoplite soldiers, in this case, probably two cities warring with each other, going into fight. The thing about the hoplites was this. They fought as a unit. Each fighter had a spear and they had a shield, as you can see there. And soldiers were not poor men. They had to be men who had enough money to own some property because you had to buy your own spear and you had to buy your own shield. So if you were truly poor, you can't be a member of the hoplite. It's generally your ordinary farmers or people of higher status than that who can afford to participate. The thing is, if you're fighting as a member of a hoplite unit, you have to utterly trust and depend on the other men you're fighting with, because your shield doesn't shield you so much as it shields the guy next to you. So if you're going into battle, you're marching into battle with those spears coming at you. You are depending on the guy next to you to stay in step, to not break and run, to not give up. And so you have to trust each other, and you have to trust each other's willingness to fight. And that becomes sort of one of the key definitions of what it means to be a full citizen, a full member of the city, was your willingness to fight in these terms. Fighting, however, was not a full-time occupation for these soldiers in the hoplites. It was something you did in the winter when you couldn't farm. So you farm in the spring and summer and into the fall. In the winter, when you can't grow crops, that's when you fight your wars. And then when it's time for the spring planting, everybody goes back home again and takes it up again next year. So they were literally farmer soldiers and citizens. A lot of the official parts of the city were places for men only, male citizens only. The agora, like we talked about, the marketplace. The banquets, where we know about them mostly because of the dialogues of Plato, where it's represented Socrates and other symposium guests are there at these banquets, and they have these great philosophical discussions. A lot of banquets, symposia, probably ought to focus more on things like having music played, drinking a great deal, dancing girls, and things like that. But in some of them, they undoubtedly also discuss philosophy. You can sort of see there, those are men at a symposia on that drinking vessel. You can sort of tell that they're getting into it as the evening goes on. And in fact, what that vessel would have been used for is Greeks didn't drink their wine straight. They mixed it with water. It was very intense. And so that would be the vessel you'd add the wine to in the water to get it ready to drink. The gymnasia, gymnasium, places for athletic competition. That's another way that Greek men proved their manhood, was through athletic competitions. Those were also male domains. And those are all areas, like I said, that women generally only enter as slaves, as servants, as prostitutes, as children. Women are the next group. They are not citizens in the sense that they have no political role in the city, no political decision-making power, no official head of house status, no ability to own property. Greek ideas about women, particularly in Athens, and this is sort of more generally spread as well, though there's a few notable exceptions. The concept of how women existed, I think, is so summed up well by the philosopher Aristotle, who basically argues that women are incomplete men. And he explains that the way that this works is that women in their wombs have the raw material for conception. But when a man has sex with a woman, then he contributes to her in his semen the power of life and energy. And that gives energy to this raw material. And however much gets in there, that determines how much energy is going to be there for what is conceived. And if there's enough for it to make a full being, you get a man, because there's been enough materials contributed by the man to give it full life, full development. But if there is not enough provided, you get an incomplete being. You get a woman. Women are irrational. Women are emotional. They're untrustworthy. They're easily seduced. There will be exceptions, but generally, the famous Greek saying is that the best thing you can say of a woman is just to not have anything to say about her at all, because she lived her life within her household. She was a good wife. She wove cloth, but she never got attention in public. Nobody ever had to talk about her because there was nothing to say. Marriage, and once again, we're drawing on Athens, but this was true, we think, often, also for many of the other cities. Marriage, the way it usually worked, is older husbands, 25 to 35, and younger wives, 14 or 15. A woman, therefore, a girl, would go from her father's authority to her husband's authority. She's never going to have a time in which she's going to be independent. And the sort of summary, Demosthenes is a famous Athenian politician, and as he summarized it, we keep hetare for the sake of pleasure. Hetare are more than prostitutes. They're women who are courtesans, I guess you might say. They have a level of independence and ability to choose their own companions, but in essence, they make their careers by pleasing men, either as entertainers, as companions, or sexually as well. So we keep hetare for the sake of pleasure, female slaves for our daily care, and wives to give us legitimate children and to be the guardians of our household. Not to say that husbands and wives couldn't have love and companionship and sexual pleasure between them, but the absolutely essential thing, the minimum thing a wife needs to provide, is she needs to provide legitimate children, legitimate heirs, male heirs, to pass the property down to through the descent, and she has to run that household. And those are the key things for a wife to do, her duties. That's also one of the reasons why it's encouraged for women to stay within the household and not to go outside of it. Because the basic fact of the matter is that before DNA testing, you always know who an infant's mother is. There's no doubt about that. But you can't know who the infant's father is for 100% surety. There's no way to test it. And so if your concern is about keeping goods going down the line of male inheritance, one of the approaches to that is to try to control women so that you know that they haven't had the opportunity to get impregnated by someone else. And the need to pass property down the family line is important enough that actually it would be acceptable that if a man dies in a family that had property, obviously if you're really poor, nobody's going to care about this because there's nothing to inherit. But if you had property and your father dies and he only leaves behind a daughter, it would be acceptable for either her cousins, or if they're not cousins, even her uncle, to marry her, simply to, once again, bring that property back through inheritance into that male line. Wives, therefore, build their lives about managing the household and working closely with their daughters, with slave women, with the women within that household. They weave cloth for clothing and trade. They preserve, they process, and prepare food. They bear and raise children. That's the essential duties of a wife. And the essential duties of a husband are to do the things to make that possible. To provide materially so that household can function, so the things that they're going to produce would come into it, and also to not in any way endanger the status and power of the wife. So, for example, it would not be a wife's concern if her husband is going outside of the home and having an affair with somebody so much. What would be a major threat to her position was if he was having an affair with someone in her household that could challenge her authority, or even worse, if he was having children with another woman, because that threatens her children's right to inherit, and that threatens her status as the woman head of the household. So that would be the critical thing. At the base, you have slaves, not citizens. And there's not as many of those in Hellenic civilizations you're going to see later in the Hellenistic societies, but they're still an important part of the society. Slaves primarily come from being prisoners of war. In some cases, they may be born into slavery, or they're the product of going into debt or sale. So if you come up with a huge amount of debts and you can't pay them off, the creditor, the person you owe money to, would have the right to have you seized and sold into slavery to pay off your debts. Alternatively, if you've got massive amounts of debts and you can't pay it off, you might sell your children into slavery to get the resources you need to pay off your debts, and in that case, they would be enslaved. This means that women ultimately are going to have an extra level of vulnerability because a lot of this they can't control. They can't control whether or not the family goes into debt often, and they definitely can't control whether or not the family is on the winning side in a war. And sort of one of the classic examples of that is the poem The Iliad, which is about the Trojan War, and in there they have white-armed Andromache led their songs of sorrow, cradling the head of Hector, man killing Hector gently in her arms. "Oh, my husband, cut off from life so young, you leave me a widow, lost in the royal halls, and the boy only a baby, the son we bore together, you and I so doomed. I cannot think he will ever come to manhood. Long before the city will be sacked, plundered top to bottom, because you are dead, her great guardian, you who always defended Troy, who kept her loyal wives and helpless children safe, all who will soon be carried off in the hollow ships, and I with them. And you, my child, will follow me to labor somewhere at harsh, degrading work, slaving under some heartless master's eye. That or some Archaean marauder will seize you by the arm and hurl you headlong down from the ramparts. Horrible death enraged at you because Hector once cut down his brother, his father, or his son." This is an epic poem, but there's a piece there that is real to women and children on a much more basic level, which is if that one of these constant wars that were fought were lost, or these frequent wars at least, the price for that could be enslavement quite often, or even possibly death. And that was part of the way it worked. Slaves, therefore, it's based on your status as the people who lost through debt, through losing the war. It's not based on race. And so, therefore, ethnically, often slaves are the same ethnicity, or usually, as those of the people who own them. There may be exception of people who are brought in, but generally it's simply people like you. And that social experience they have, that social difference, is what makes them have that status of slave. It's not based on the concept of race. So slaves often were teachers, they were handmaidens, they were entertainers. A handmaiden, sort of a servant girl, is what you're seeing in that picture there. The woman sitting down is the mistress. You can tell because she's the woman who's sort of in better dressed. She's sitting down. She's in a power of authority. Also, a lot of times in ancient pictures, it wouldn't be uncommon to see well, no, not so much for this one. Okay, so she's in the person of authority, and then you have next to her handmaidens who's waiting for her. And you get a sense there. You're not looking at them as being portrayed as being ethnically different. It's a matter of social status. Depends on the city. They estimate that they could be 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of the city of Athens were slaves. And the really critical part about slaves is they create leisure for the citizens. So a lot of the activities you see in a city like Athens, which has very active involvement in politics, in judicial acts, in all kinds of philosophy and all that other stuff that's going on, one of the things that makes that possible is that slave labor provides the leisure for Athenian citizens to participate in those activities. Athens and Sparta are often seen as the two examples of city-states, what they're like, and they do have some significant differences. What made Athens distinctive was the concept of democracy. The idea that you will abandon kings, they gave up on kings, and you have direct participation among the citizens, and citizens being free, adult, Athenian-born males. And democracy in this sense it's not just this issue of you vote for somebody and that's your representative. Often decision-making will literally be through a large group of Athenian citizens who will serve as a large jury, who will take part in these large meetings. And so it's a much more direct sense of political participation than we think of in our modern democracies. Sparta's different. Sparta was defined as being a warrior culture. And what makes the difference for Sparta is that in the case of Sparta, all that stuff I said about slaves not being ethnically determined, Sparta's the exception. The Spartans conquered the local people in the area, the Helots is what they were called. They conquered those people, and then they built their city on control of the Helots. The Helots do the farming. They act basically as a permanent slave class. However, the Helots do not want to remain as a permanent slave class, and so there are multiple attempts from them to rise up in rebellion against the Spartans. So Spartan society is built around being a warrior culture so they can keep control of the Helots and keep them as slaves. Because of that, male lives are really devoted to warfare and to training. They spend a large portion of their lives even living in barracks. Because of that, women in Sparta are more independent. They manage their households, they manage their businesses, because if men are going to devote their lives to warfare, there's a lot of other stuff that has to be done, and it's women who end up doing it. So in fact, if you sort of compare those cities, Athens is the one who has more direct political participation, more widely dispersed decision-making, what we would now say is what they would call a democracy. In this one particular group, though, in Sparta, women, that's where they have much greater freedom. Though, obviously, if you're a Helot, it's not a place of freedom at all.